Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're all here, so we're going to get started. We may be joined by a few other folks. I know at the end of the day, people are trying to make their way over to Haynes Hall. Of course, people get lost in this UCLA campus as well, so we make the most of it. Really glad to be here. I'm Darnell Hunt. I'm director of the Ralph J. Bunn Center for African American Studies, and we are one of the co-sponsors of this exciting event, Science Revolution. Why Knowing What's True has everything to do with getting beyond this world of horrors, a presentation exchange in the new communism developed by Bob Avakian. I'm going to just say a few words about our co-sponsors. We have UCLA, AAP, the Bunn Center, of course, the Bob Avakian Institute, and American Indian Studies. If I'm leaving out any co-sponsors, please admonish me later. We'll take care of it. I think I've covered most of the. I'm sorry? Oh, that's right. Reynaldo Macias, as an individual, is also co-sponsoring this. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Annie Day, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the program and the participants. Annie?
Darnell, and very glad to welcome you all here and looking forward to a vigorous discussion. My name is Annie Day. I'm with the Bob Avakian Institute, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later. So the program here is, we're thrilled to have Andy Z speaking on behalf of the Bob Avakian Institute. He's the spokesperson for Revolution Books in New York City, which is the center of the intellectual life of the movement for an actual revolution. And he is also a co-initiator of refusefascism.org. And first he's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to welcome up Professor Andrew Apter, who's a professor of history and anthropology. And he'll be followed by comments by Juan Gómez-Quiñones, who's a professor of history as well, Chicano studies. So that is the plan, and then after the respondents, I'll come up, or the discussants, I'll come up and I'll just have a 2-minute announcement about the work of the Bob Avakian Institute and how you can be involved. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A and for discussion and with all three participants. So that's the plan for our afternoon. So with that, I'd like to welcome up Andy Z.
Okay, so welcome. Glad to be here in California. I want to first repeat, but thank again the co-sponsors of the event, the Bunn Center, the AAP, the Center for American Indian Studies, Professor Macias, and the Discussants, Andrew Apter and Juan Gómez-Quiñones. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and bear with me. I want to also make a special appreciation to the Bob Avakian Institute for hosting the event. And I want to begin by drawing your attention to why this institute matters. As we meet this afternoon, masses of people, billions of people, in actual fact, suffer horribly. The planet is now in extreme peril. And the potential for humanity to move beyond a world of mass starvation, disease, wars without end, degradation, oppression, and exploitation is thwarted, and it's stifled by the workings of the system of capitalism, imperialism that prevails now everywhere throughout the world. There is the basis in the productive capacity, the technology, and the creativity and knowledge of the people to transform the world, to move beyond the economic, political, and social formations that today so brutally destroy lives and crush spirits. Unlocking that potential requires understanding it, comprehending the complex reality of the world as it actually is, so as to discover the pathways to fundamental change through a strategic approach to an actual revolution, and for a radically new world, a radically new society on the road to human emancipation. This is the breakthrough and the ongoing work and leadership of Bob Avakian. For over 40 years, Bob Avakian has been digging into the reality humanity faces, grappling with the theory and the practice to break out of a long, dark night of millennia of oppression. He critically examined the liberatory first communist revolutions of the 20th century, first in the Soviet Union and then the People's Republic of China. How they began blazing a path to a world where the slaves would be slaves no more, and he critically delved into their defeats, fearlessly excavating and interrogating their shortcomings in method and approach, and how they went at the problems they encountered in forging a world where exploitation is not the engine that drives the world, undergirding every other form of oppression that the people suffer. Drawing from this experience and ranging widely from scholars, scientists, artists, as well as from sports and music, Avakian has made a qualitative breakthrough in putting revolution and communism on a thoroughly and consistently scientific footing, stripping away those previous aspects of communist theory that were not scientific. And with this as the foundational method and approach of the new synthesis of communism, Bob Avakian has made breakthroughs in strategy for actual revolution. He's developed a radically new conception of socialism, authoring the Constitution for the Future Socialist State as both a far more liberatory society and one that is on the road to communism. And he has made breakthroughs in internationalism, in the understanding of why, in order to free humanity from the chains of imperialism, the whole world must come first. And Bob Avakian developed the new synthesis of communism while leading the Revolutionary Communist Party to be a vanguard force for an actual revolution in a period when revolution was regarded by most as a thing of the past. Yet, today we face a moment in history where more than ever the world cries out for an emancipatory revolution, and where there is a new framework for revolution in this new synthesis, and yet the breakthrough in revolutionary theory, so necessary for human emancipation, is not known, and the forces for that revolution need to be brought forward, and soon. So I want to encourage you to find out more about and support the work of the BA Institute, whose mission is the preserving, projecting, and promoting the works and the vision of Bob Avakian with the aim of reaching the broadest possible audience. Today's program furthers that mission, and my talk today is rooted in Avakian's leadership and in the new synthesis of communism. I look forward to an exchange of views that's based on this. And I hope each of you will be provoked and inspired to get more deeply into BA's work and to support and join in the work of the Institute. So let's get into our topic. Why knowing what's true has everything to do with getting beyond a world of horrors. Bob Avakian has written, "The struggle in the realm of epistemology, the theory of knowledge and how it is acquired by people, the theory of what is true and how people come to know the truth, is a crucial arena in the overall battle for the emancipation of the oppressed and the exploited majority of humanity, and ultimately of humanity as a whole. Grasping the defining characteristics and importance of the scientific method, and most of all, the most consistent, systematic, and comprehensive scientific approach to reality, the communist world outlook and method, which can embrace, without replacing or suffocating the many fields of human knowledge and endeavor, can give expression to the richest process of learning about reality and transforming it in the interests of humanity, and this is of vital importance for the emancipatory struggle." As I said, humanity is today locked in a world of deprivation, of wars, of environmental destruction, brutal oppression of differently gendered persons, of minority nationalities in different countries around the world. Black people in the US are subjected to unending discrimination and a slow genocide with 2.3 million people in hellhole prisons, while police brutality and murder continue unabated and unpunished. Women here and around the world are degraded and oppressed in ways that are unspeakable for those with eyes willing to confront the brutal reality that half of humanity faces. Bob Avakian has sharply pointed out that today people can say, can depict, and do to women what you could not do to any other group in society. That's true, and that's one reason why the liberation of women is a cornerstone of the new communism and the revolution to achieve it. The goal of the new communism is a total revolution, the most radical revolution in human history that aims at nothing less than overcoming all forms of oppression and exploitation all over the world. A society where humanity could truly flourish. To make such a revolution requires understanding reality as it actually is. A method and approach to discover what's true and then to transform the world on the basis of the actual underlying contradictions and the contradictions within those conditions. We meet today as a full-out fascist regime is in power in the world's most powerful nation. Matters of epistemology, or how you know what you know, are thrown into sharp relief, as is everything else in society. Fake news, alternative facts, conspiracy theories. To say these are false narratives and are mobilizing people in harmful ways is understatement. And going deeper, they obscure and divert people from understanding the essence of what is happening and acting commensurately. The Trump-Pence regime is furiously battling now to consolidate fascism here. Their enraged social base is moving on campuses and holding KKK Nazi-style rallies all around the country. Their rabid followers attack immigrants as the enemy. 2 courageous heroes in Portland were murdered and one seriously wounded for standing up to this. These men are models of acting on your moral conviction based on what is right and what is true. The Trump-Pence regime has not yet succeeded in consolidating fascism in law or in society, but they are moving rapidly. And even with the significant opposition that was expressed in several mass demonstrations and many smaller protests over the last 5 months, there is not as yet the level of unrelenting political struggle from below, from the people, aimed at driving this regime out of power, which is the only way to stop them. This cabal of fascists, headed by Trump and Pence, came to power under the signboard of a mythology of Make America Great Again. A narrative that, if you'll excuse the pun, trumps and encompasses 2 other reactionary narratives. One, that this country is the biblical shining city on a hill whose future requires defeating the elite demons running the world and banishing all others who are not white men and their submissive wives, ostracizing all who are not fundamentalist Christians, and thereby returning America to, as they would have it in their myth, a theocratic Christian state. And the second myth, that the greatness of America rests on the ingenuity of the self-made man, that the greatest good and even virtue comes from a society where naked self-interest is unfettered. In short, the Gordon Gekko ideology, greed is good. The Trump-Pence regime, as with all fascist regimes, is enforcing a worldview of lies, of alternative facts, a narrative of the victimized that tells of an aggrieved class of people, an aggrieved class of the entitled, anointed by God, or by virtue of what they believe is their innate superiority and entitlement, that is being kept down by alien forces, foreigners, non-Christians, elites, people of color, losers in the lexion favored by Trump, all of whom are peoples to be vanquished in order to return the country and the aggrieved white men to their rightful place. This fascist mythology, the America First and Make America Great Again narratives, clash with what has been the more dominant narrative promoted by the Democrats, liberals and progressives, media talking heads and the mainstream press, of America as the land of liberty and equality, of freedom for all, of give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. A country always progressing towards a more perfect union, where what's good for business is good for all, and if there is still inequality, well, there can be some regulation of capitalism to placate the middle classes, but as for the poor, The benevolence, as for the poor, it's the politics
So-called personal responsibility.
of personal responsibility, which in reality means the policy of poverty and punishment. And yes, the benevolence of the rich can offer some alms through NGO charity rather. And this is where you have experienced mass deportations and in mass incarceration. Yes, and under the Democrats, Bill Clinton and Obama. Because this system has no future for millions who are locked on society's bottom. And if some of the more awake followers of this liberal myth point out the actual misery that is everywhere in this richest country in history, the pathetic bottom line of this myth, their answer is, well, this may not be a perfect system, but it's better than any other. None of these narratives are true. All of them reflect the interests of different sections of the ruling classes. They overlap and they obscure the reality of America founded on slavery and the genocide of the native peoples, the theft of 1/3 of the land of Mexico, the bloody history of the U.S. becoming the world's dominant imperialist power, where for every year of its existence it has waged a war of conquest, meddled in the elections of other countries when not outright fomenting or directing coups d'etats. They conceal that the U.S. is ruled by a dictatorship of a ruling class that enforces a system of exploitation. And what we are experiencing now is an acute struggle at the top that is drawing in every other class and social force over what will be the cohering form of this bourgeois dictatorship. Whether it will be fascism, which relies on open terror and violence in which civil and legal rights are effectively nullified, or the normal oppressive workings of bourgeois democracy. And it matters which one wins. This is not some other narrative that I'm offering you, a radical communist narrative. This is historical fact and its current reality. History that tells of enormous cost to humanity when people believe and act on stories that aren't true. And this underscores the tremendous stakes and import of a scientific approach to reality. So, what is science, and can and should it be applied to society? Ardea Skybreak in the book Science and Revolution on the importance of science to society and the new synthesis of communism and the leadership of Bob Avakian paraphrases Neil deGrasse Tyson and says, quote, "Science allows you to confront and identify problems, to recognize problems and figure out how to solve them, rather than to run away from them." She says science is a tool, a very powerful tool. It is a method and approach for being able to tell what's true, what corresponds to reality as it actually is. And science is an evidence-based process. And she goes on to make a very important point. Quote, "Without science, you can only say what you as an individual think reality is. Or maybe you can say what a whole bunch of people think reality is. Or maybe you can say what a government or a religious authority or some other authority might tell you reality is like. But that doesn't make any of it true. Without science, you are at the mercy of being manipulated, of having your thinking manipulated, and not being able to tell what's right from what's wrong and what's true from what is false." So just take a moment and think about the implications of that. To know and change the world requires understanding the world as it actually is, looking beneath the surface to discover the social processes through which people provide for the needs of life and to rear new generations of people. Just as a microscope and a theoretical understanding of cells, of DNA, provide the tools to discover the mechanisms of life and the pathways to curing disease, so too does the scientific theory of communism, dialectical materialism, reveal the roots of society and how it can be cured. What is the economic foundation of society? What is the character of the institutions that arise on this foundation? How are all the social relations, those forms of oppression that we are all too familiar with today, shaped and constrained by this economic system? How do traditional ideas reinforce these economic, political, and social relations? and decisive to changing all of this, what are the contradictions that are developing within all of this that we can go to work on and lead to a total revolution? Look, we really can struggle together to get to a world where people work and struggle together for the common good, where everyone contributes whatever they can to society and gets back what they need to live a life worthy of human beings, where there are no more divisions among people in which some rule over and oppress others, robbing them not only of the means to a decent life, but also of the knowledge and a means for really understanding and acting to change the world. This, an actual revolution, leading to a total revolution, is brought to life in Bob Avakian's The New Communism. But making revolution to emancipate humanity throughout the world is complex. It is also real, and it is rooted in the real-world contradictions that we face. So despite the surreal appearance, Donald Trump is also real. Make America Great mobilizes a fascist base with a false narrative. But the Trump-Pence regime holds power and is backed by power. And thus, their ideas and their policies are being realized today. And should this regime fully succeed, more and more people will come to see that, they're right. Watch cable news and you can see this normalization process unfold. And on the other side, despite its mythology, this land does not belong to you and me. America and the capitalism and imperialism are not the land of opportunity and forces for good and the best that humanity can do. But based on its power and control of all the institutions of society, this is what many, if not most people in this country, believe to be true. Perhaps as a little kid, a parent tried to teach you that might doesn't make right. But then life teaches you otherwise, unless you take up a scientific approach to knowing and changing the world. You won't understand why it is that what is so wrong so often prevails. Or you won't get the science that lies behind the insight of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that, quote, the ruling ideas of an epoch are ever the ideas of the ruling class, and how that can be worked on and transformed through revolution. If you don't understand the dynamics, the underlying dynamics of society, you're going to be played. We run into this all the time. The politicians and the pundits declare, and the people then follow suit and say, the problem is corruption. The problem is money in politics, or it's greed, or it's human nature, or it's men, or it's white people. The list goes on. Without understanding of how a society functions, getting under the hood of how it works, you really can't know or solve the problem. Police brutality and murder disproportionately target Black and Latino youth, with pigs never held to account. No justice, only payouts to keep quiet. What you think needs to be done about this unconscionable outrage depends on whether you understand what the root of the problem is. Give police sensitivity training, have a community review board, wear body cams, not even close. The problem is that the job of the police is to serve and protect the capitalist system. Their function is to protect the right of the ruling class to exploit and oppress the masses. And if there is no way for the masses to survive, then they must be terrorized into submission, locked up, or even murdered. The deep foundational structure of white supremacy in this country has and will continue to result in the most brutal repression and targeting of Black and Latino youth. You can't reform that away. It's too woven into the fabric of this system and its functioning. We must fight the power and transform the people for revolution, but to understand that, you need science. If you go to the doctor and you have symptoms that could either indicate a sore back or perhaps a cancer of the spine, or perhaps you have a chest discomfort that could be acid reflux or maybe a heart condition, for sure you want a doctor grounded in the latest scientific medical understanding to determine what the specific disease is that's causing your symptoms, followed by what are tested treatments of the correctly diagnosed disease. You don't want to take a Tums for a heart attack or put Bengay on a cancer. Nor should you want to be told that the cure is for you to atone for your sins and pray. The same is true for diagnosing and setting a course of treatment for the ills of society. But when it comes to human society, even many scientists say you can't apply scientific knowledge. You can't apply scientific methodology. It's too complex, too subjective. This is nonsense. Ardea Skybreak makes the point that it is exactly the opposite. Because of the complexity of human society, a scientific approach is all the more needed. I'm going to talk a little bit about materialism versus idealism. Because at the heart of the matter is, well, matter. All of reality, even the processes of our consciousness, takes place through matter in motion. Our ideas are reflections of objective material reality, and they can impact objective reality. And that is one reason we can know that a reality objectively exists. We can get into that in the discussion. Philosophically, this is reflected in two modes of thinking: materialism versus idealism. Materialism, dialectical materialism, means that your conception of the world flows from a fundamental understanding that everything exists as matter. Matter that is constantly changing and that is always in motion, moving through contradiction. And this stands in opposition to philosophical idealism. The view that, as Avakian writes in The New Communism, reality is an extension of ideas, ideas in the minds of individuals. For example, he says, maybe this doesn't exist for you, but it exists for me. We hear this kind of thing all the time, this relativism. Well, that might be your truth, but my truth says something different. God may exist for you, God may not exist for you, but God definitely exists for me. No, if God exists at all, then God exists for everybody. Avakian insists that it matters not just what people think, but even more fundamentally, how they think, how they approach the world. And this is not only sharply contended in society and the world, but it's also among many who claim to be seeking some kind of progressive or radical change, and even among many who proclaim to be communists. Unfortunately, such idealist approaches to social change and revolution results in a kind of religious approach that views the arc of history as always bending towards progress, or what is too often prevailed among communists, that communism is inevitable. Such views disarm people from being able to actually confront and then act on and transform the reality that they actually face. So now let me speak briefly about relativism versus a scientific approach to reality. Alternative facts, being guided by narratives and not what is actually true, reaches both the absurd and the deadly dangerous with Trump and his whole regime. I had the biggest inaugural crowd. Mexicans are criminals and rapists. Muslims are all potential terrorists. Climate change is a hoax. Dangerous lies, but backed up by Fox Media and the power of the state. But how different is this methodologically from Obama saying that the problem black youth face is that they don't take personal responsibility and that they should pull up their pants? Really? Is this the cause of the oppression of black people? No, and believing it because Obama, as the first black president, said it doesn't make it true. It actually makes it all the more dangerous. And on the campuses, this relativism is rampant in identity politics, a mode of thinking where who is speaking and whether they are or are not the most oppressed person in the room determines the validity of their ideas. And communists have also had a variant of this same thing, that the workers or the most oppressed have a special purchase on the truth. So look, it's sometimes the case that those who have lived a life under the most vicious boot of this system may more readily gravitate towards revolution. But their position in society does not in and of itself provide an understanding of how society works, or of the theory, the strategy, and the programs to transform it. Another example, all too common on the campuses today, is that if an uncomfortable truth is spoken and this upsets someone, then a safe space must be created where this intrusion of the true brutality of the real world is prohibited. Or, in the social movements of resistance, this slogan is chanted in demonstrations. The people, united, will never be defeated. But is this true? Bob Avakian has pointed out that people have been united and been defeated many times, both for reasons that their adversaries were stronger, and sometimes because of shortcomings or mistakes in how the struggle was led. Yes, it is good and it is necessary to unite people around a correct understanding of reality and a strategy and a plan that flows from that. But it's just a seemingly useful political truth that the people united will never be defeated. And it misleads. This is a reflection of what Avakian has critiqued as populist epistemology, that whatever most people think at any given time determines what's true. You know, Facebook reality, thumbs up or thumbs down. The mode of thinking that denies that there is objective reality, that there is only subjective experience, I have my truth and you have yours, leaves people unequipped to deal with the momentous problems that humanity faces today. It leaves you blind to discover where there are sharp and profound contradictions brewing beneath the surface, which could hold the potential for revolutionary change. You can't act with conviction about anything other than yourself without science. It is prevalent in academia that even to claim there is objective reality is totalizing, totalitarian, because it doesn't leave room for what? My ideas. Some of whom are influenced by postmodernism claim that the insistence that there is objective reality and a scientific way to understand and transform that reality is what led to the problems of the 20th century revolutions. This relativism, that there is no objective truth, that we can only act with any certitude about what has been demonstrated through scientific verification is true, is nonsense. But it's not just nonsense. The relativist construct of competing narratives that must all be brought together is wrong, and it's harmful. Does the history and present lived reality of oppressed and marginalized people need to be uncovered, need to be told, need to be paid attention to and redressed? Absolutely. But what is true about this history is true not just for that group, it is part of the larger reality, it is part of the history of humanity and its causes and solutions sought for in that larger reality, with then unity forged on that foundation. Relativism keeps everyone and the struggle in their lane, confined to thinking about and only acting on what concerns them. It cuts off the kind of process necessary to know and to change the world. Avakian makes the point in The New Communism that, quote, everybody who's a relativist is a relativist until it really matters to them, end quote. You wouldn't let your kid run out in the street in front of a car because who's to say if that car is real for him or it's real for you? You wouldn't do it. So that relativism goes out the window when you actually know something about objective reality. The relativism of Trump and his world of useful alternative facts on the one hand, and the relativism that pervades and poisons the movements of opposition on the other, are completely and diametrically opposed in morality. On the one hand, the relativism that pervades and poisons the movements, they're completely opposed to morality. One stands on the side of gloatingly enforcing oppression, and the other in fighting against oppression and wanting a much more just world. But methodologically, the parallels of proceeding from your truth, your group's reality, from what's useful to you, your cause, your people, your agenda in the immediate moment, will and can only lead away from understanding the root of the problem that humanity faces and to leaving the world the horror that it is. So since I brought this back to Trump, and before concluding, I want to commend to your attention two works by Avakian. One is called The Truth About the Right-Wing Conspiracy and Why Clinton and the Democrats Are No Answer. It's available on the table out front, as is The Coming Civil War and the Repolarization for Revolution in the Present Era. These two works not only deeply reveal the roots of fascism in America, but they are a stunning example of the scientific approach of Bob Avakian applied to the political and social world. So I want to recommend that you check that out. Now, when you get into The New Communism, which is also available, And when you dig into the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic and his other work, you will see that he not only advocates for a scientific approach to reality and to making revolution, but in what is a real game changer, Bob Avakian breaks ground in creating a new framework for how masses of people can wield and apply science to society, creating a movement today and a future society to unleash the maximum creativity, the maximum ferment and experimentation and dissent on the basis of a solid core of understanding that is integral to carrying forward the aims and objectives of the revolution to free all of humanity. So I'm going to conclude now with a quote from this Handbook for Revolution, Basics. It's basics from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian, and it was reprinted on the promotional flyer and poster for this event. And this quote serves as a certain concentration of his qualitative breakthrough in the scientific epistemology of the new synthesis. And it brings home why it's so integral to humanity to get free. With all that the people of the world face today, we're fortunate to have this work, this leadership, and this institute at this moment. And hopefully this quotation will also serve as a provocation for our discussion. So I'm going to quote this. Quote, "For humanity to advance beyond a state where might makes right, where things ultimately come down to raw power relations, will require as a fundamental element in this advance an approach to understanding things, or an epistemology, which recognizes that reality and truth are objective and do not vary in accordance with nor depend on different narratives and how much authority an idea or a narrative may have behind it, or how much power and force can be wielded on behalf of any particular idea or narrative at any given point." So thank you very much, and I look forward to Apter and Juan Gómez-Quiñones.
No, you're going to go first. In alphabetical order.
You've been in the struggle longer than I have. You're my senior.
Okay, now, so see, this is what I was talking about. Which is real. They're both real. He's been in the struggle longer, and his name starts with A, as did mine. But I could have gotten away with a Z and spoken at the end, but I didn't.
I speak from here, right?
No, I can speak from here. I can speak from here. Or would you rather sit down?
Let's see how it goes. Okay. I want to make some comments on Marx, and many of them would be pronunciations that you probably heard before. And I would like to start with the fact that Marx is a historical persona, historical actor at a given time under certain conditions. I think many people, including his critics, would very quickly agree that he is a major thinker, perhaps the major thinker of the 19th century. He lived within the 19th century. There are any number of important contributions that he made in a life of hardship in many ways, and disappointments in others. One has to point out, though, that he never really participated, one can tell, in a revolutionary process, or at least I would believe that, point that out. And he never was a frontline leader in a revolution. While those characteristics do apply to major figures that came after his death. No small accomplishment that he gave us the most thoroughgoing economic analysis of modern society of any person. And an individual who has done that for all of us has to be honored by becoming familiar with his main ideas and keeping always in the forefront the important contributions that he made. Forthwith declaring that revolution is necessary, more than necessary, indispensable for the future of mankind, and that it can be achieved. If you look at his time, apart from the many quarrels going on in Europe, and there are always quarrels going on in Europe, maybe that's the big contribution that Europe and Europeans have made, with the exception of people like Marx, and that is feeding us a whole baggage of conflicts and the reasons for those conflicts in terms of material interests that still plague the world. And one must hastily point out what you all know: things are not getting better, they're getting worse. But placing him in line with other thinkers, one can say people like Arthur Schopenhauer, Friedrich Nietzsche, Benedetto Croce, and particularly the last figure, made contributions in terms of understanding the subjective as well as the political, from points of view different from the starting block of Karl Marx. It's also telling that they were all pessimists. That is, they did not really believe that there was much progress in the human condition, and that at most individuals can take aesthetic satisfaction in given moments and in given works on their own. And what it is of course a confession that a change is inevitable, and one must think that they believe, the way many do now, that the world, as our previous speaker pointed out, was the best of possible worlds, even if it was grossly unjust. Croce was particularly gifted in telling us about the arts and the human spirit. He had positive, progressive aspects, perhaps in relation to wanting to contribute to the diffusion of the arts in a broad manner, in contradistinction to how the arts were privileged during his lifetime. If you come to writers like Spengler and Toynbee, it is telling that these major writers, or at least so considered, are in fact also pessimists. This strain of pessimism should be telling to at least some circles that read these types of writings. I mean, pessimism is a very heartfelt, in most cases, belief that the world is rather than possible, impossible. We come to another set of writers, and those are the ones that one can consider as empiricists, driven by a strong belief that through the analysis and identification of facts, of arranging them in given order, that there will be insights that will be possible to, one, achieving certain solutions in regards to material issues and questions. And they were, to a certain point, willing to consider that this heavy emphasis on empirical fact gathering and limited fact analysis provided a better road to material progress than what society previously had believed in. one could look at any number of individuals during the life of Marx, or individuals who lived shortly after his life. Marx gives us an understanding of historical development, and though one couldn't quarrel and amend the facts of historical development, the fact that he laid it out, as is the case for any pioneering theorist, that he was more than pioneering. There's a major step forward for all the rest of us. And his formulations, both in German ideology, written at the mid-century, and critique of political economy, some 10, 20 years later, posit his significant theoretical framework elaborations in some ways more so than the 3 volumes of Capital, which many people at most, even when they're interested, at most barely browse, because the first volume knocks them on their feet. And they never get to the point that actually it's the 3rd volume that is the meatiest and more helpful, at least to those of us that are not that heavily into economic terms and vocabulary. He upholds a positivist epistemology, right? And we heard something on epistemology very tellingly just a second enough. He did strenuously stress the attainment of objectivity. In line with his thinking, if you do not have that, and if that is not really real, how can you bring about change? And in those logical arrangements, there's a tremendous amount of hope. Simply put, that is that if human beings have made the world as it is, human beings can, in fact, improve on it and change it. And that is a uniquely important thought, profound thought that does away with all the pessimisms at hand. And one does have to keep coming back to pessimism because it is such an important temper among people. And if you think about it, it's a very clever presented or gifted truism. Yeah, too bad things are the way they are, and you really can't do much about it. And it doesn't take more than a skip to figure out who that benefits, and that benefits the people who are quite happy with the status quo and would like to make it even more of a status quo. Marx, as most of you or all of you know, looks at a number of important points, and I'm willing to go through them quickly. Social development, the universality of history, if you want, the possibility of social change, which has already been remarked upon, and the fact that change is a result of struggle, in particular class struggle in Marx. And there were people who had already pronounced this earlier than him, that class struggle of a progressive momentum is one in where the most productive circles of the society take the initiative and in fact bring it about. He stresses human affairs are a interactive movement, a dialectical process of transformation, of interrelationships, of negation of the negation. And I would like to come back to that if there was time, because there is a Damocles sword in that thought. That is, if what is being posited, that anything that comes forth from a dialectic relationship eventually too must itself be negated, which one would argue that revolution is never a single step, but really a series of steps into the future, and which way those steps might be marked and at what speed and in what direction is to be told in the future. He insists that theory is universal, and this is an important aspect, saying that indeed we are all sisters and brothers under the skin in a way that probably no one had really stressed, that whether at any given time people felt more strongly about ethnic and color relations than later. Marx and people who adhere to him closely stress that, even though, as anybody can tell, the world is super subdivided into all kinds of groups and enclaves, and rather than getting less, they seem to be getting more, even though one truism of the modernists, the original modernists, is that these differences would be smoothed out, even if they had to be cut down, as it were. To point out the negatives and to bring it to a close, the 19th century has come and gone. A human being cannot foresee something beyond their lifetime. If indeed theory is dependent on practice and not the other way around, an individual has to live the practice and the experience so that they might be able to theorize or to understand it in a better way than might have previously been the case. We know that this dependency on an optimal role for workers has not only grown more and distant, it's almost impossible to actually see unless you dig extensively into all the corners of the world. To the extent that there is a working class, and the phrase itself is a reification and an abstraction. It is not revolutionary in just about any society that one can think of. And the United States, the most advanced economic state in the world, is a perfect example of that. No one would pin their hopes on a revolutionary impetus, at least as of this moment, in regards to a working class that is victim of so many false consciousness and divided in so many ways. Rather than even moderately left, significant parts of that working class are actually to the right. We know that Marx did not adequately deal with race. And in fact, if you're being very scrutinous and hypersensitive in regards to the issue, you can spot his near racisms, and you have to ask yourself, in the way he looks at how elites arise, or the elites that he considers, does he still really believe that Europeans are the ruling population of all the others? Because it is also the case in his writing that he has very negative views on non-white people, and probably any reader, non-white reader of a particular group, if they were around at the time of Marx's writings and got into the pages of those writings, will identify remarks that probably would bring censure if uttered in a classroom today. I can certainly remember what it is that he has to say as characteristics of Mexicans, for example. He carries this thought that somehow destroying ancient cultures or cultures that are different from the European ones that he was familiar with would be a forward step in this very mechanical view of development that he often had. And one has to think what would make him be prey to those kinds of mistaken views, and what does it say of the influence that he casts on those that read and believe his writings carefully and imbue this Eurocentrism, a step away from white supremacism that nobody mentions, in inhibiting his other negatives, the struggle for power on the part of the disinherited and the exploited. To me, that's a very serious lacunae on his part. He really does not offer any real grasp on culture as made by people in their lives and in their creative activity on a daily basis, which to me reads as being insensitive to the human element that speaks to the arts and the popular culture of everyday folks. Is Marx really useful, apart from giving us an understanding of mid-level capitalist development in this small area of the globe called Europe today? I think the answer would be yes, but the challenge is more important than the answer, and that is that you indeed have to supersede Marx to fully understand the world, to fully understand its conditions of today, and importantly, where is it going? We also have a big question that isn't only simply a matter of trying to understand what it is that Wall Street does. How do we really go about changing Wall Street, garnering the support of majority of the population, and letting that population, as a result of their own free will and consciously, coalescing into a force for change. It's a tall order. I think it is taller now, more difficult than has ever been the case in human history. On the other hand, as was eloquently pointed out, what we face is really the destruction of the earth and the destruction of all of us and all the cultures, big or small, that we might consider important to us and important to the legacy of humankind. That is, destruction will be total. Thus, it's urgent to engage in analysis, to identify truth, to know how it is we really do know, and to be certain of these truths as much as possible. We have an unhappy, if you will, at least my unhappy vista is to, of course, reckon that as of now, the year 2017, one cannot point to a revolution engineered by human beings in any number of different cultures and geographies that actually has been satisfactory. You can tell me about the foils and brutalities of capitalism far outweigh those. Indeed, but the fact remains that any number of people across the globe, different countries, societies, conditions have given their lives, have sacrificed, have struggled to bring about revolution in the full sense of that word, and as yet no victory that can be claimed. And we know the words of Vietnamese leader, tell no lies and speak the truth. What comes to mind also is the challenge that Malcolm X often used as a closing remark, especially when he's looking at whether white people can actually be revolutionaries. And his remark is, only time will tell.
Thanks very much to Darnell Hunt for hosting with his co-sponsors, and thanks for the invitation here, the opportunity to try out some ideas. I don't want to be boring and simply add more agreements to the discourse, although I have to say that Juan, you kind of set things up for me nicely, because I was going to sort of push another line, sort of contrary to your position, which is to show how incredibly relevant Marx remains, even as a 19th century speaker, given the current situation. So I won't go on very long. I think time is ticking away. But first of all, I have a personal connection to Bob Avakian, although we've never met. And that is when I read his really interesting autobiography, From Ike to Mao, I discovered that we went to the same junior high school. It's now called a middle school. But it's now called King Middle School, but when I went there it was King Junior High, so named 2 years after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And it was, as I was telling my class that I was teaching earlier today, it was my real introduction from the standpoint of white privilege to American civil rights and race relations. And we were on the front lines of a very important confrontation and struggle in the 7th grade, in which I would go to school every morning and be told, "Honky, your money or your life," and I learned how to deal with that. And that's part of an education that has marked me. The other thing I like about Avakian is the fact that he not only sang doo-wop in high school, he was actually influenced a lot by the Black Panther Party and was shaped. A lot of his ideas were shaped by his experience in Berkeley and Oakland in the 60s, when Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and when the Panther movement was taking place. And I don't think many people realize that. And so he's had a kind of consciousness of Black revolutionary struggle as part of revolutionary struggle that is important. And then finally, what I like about him is that I've read a fair amount of his stuff. I've looked at some of his DVDs, his stuff, and he knows his Marx. He does. He's been at this for a long time, and he's pretty good. Now, what I don't like, okay, I'm going to represent a certain body of the academic left here, maybe comfortably positioned in higher education. We feel there's a little bit of a cult of personality in the Revolutionary Communist Party. It's about him too much. It's a little bit too much about him. You could argue, well, maybe this is what a revolutionary movement requires. It requires a certain kind of sanctification of a leader. If you think about of Lenin and Mao and the Little Red Book, and it almost takes on biblical proportions. But I think there's a hesitancy to sort of embrace the doctrine. I want to use that as my point of departure for my comments. And first of all, I want to thank my namesake, Andy Z. I basically agree with 85% of what you said today. You can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. And when I was looking at listening to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, obviously I was trying to listen to Donald Trump, but it hurt. I kept thinking, God damn, Hillary's just spouting the same old liberal line. Whereas I was a Bernie supporter, and I wish he had won, because I think that he'd be president now. I realize, the limitations that all of the candidates have, including him, but I think that he had a better analysis of the situation in the United States and its place in the global economy than anybody else. And I agree, Andy, you can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. And I thought Bernie's understanding, simplified for the electorate, was really more promising. And he wasn't afraid to use the word socialism and revolution. And for someone to have gotten as far as he did, using those terms in this day and age, is a testament to the fact that the situation is ready for change. And I only wish that he had gotten a Democratic nomination, because I think the disaffection that Trump tapped into in its distorted modalities would have been it would have been so. I think Bernie would have tapped into a lot of that from the left. So deja vu, deja Marx all over again. Why do I think Marx is still relevant today? I've had this argument with so many people, especially starting in the 90s, when Clinton's term took off. Bill Clinton, when it took a turn up when the dot-com revolution started making a lot of money. I remember at the time a good friend of mine, Moishe Bastone, is one of the greatest Marxist theorists alive today. Time and Social Domination is an incredible book. I remember him saying, well, it's not a very good time to be a Marxist these days because nobody thinks it's relevant. And we heard a lot at that time about the second shift. The first shift in the American economy was from the production and industrial economy to a service economy. And then the shift after that is from a service economy to an information economy. And I thought, no, information economy makes no sense. Information doesn't have value by itself. It has to have value in relation to a system. So the first point I want to make is that with all of the economists talking about new forms of valuation and new forms of speculative and finance capital and this and that, at the end of the day, the wealth of the dot-com and the digital finance economy still rests on what Marx called the hidden abode of production. It's just that you couldn't see it because it had been outsourced so effectively. But it's no coincidence that all of the sort of financial instruments, the markets, the digital speculative futures, it all rests on the fact that labor was getting hyper-exploited, first in countries like Mexico, then it moved to Southeast Asia, China. And the fact that, just to take an example, that Apple has made so much money on the backs of Chinese workers whose working conditions resemble that of 19th century Britain, shows me that there's no value in information if at some point production is still not generating value through surplus extraction. Now, let me just say a few things about the talk today, the presentation by Andy. I feel that absolutely in agreement with the fact that we can theorize. Theorizing is a luxury. Postmodernism is a luxury. Deconstruction is a luxury. These are all movements I've been involved in personally. And at the end of the day, when you're in trouble, you have to get real. We are in trouble. We are in trouble. And I also agree that the kind of, the idea of safe spaces, I mean, I'm not, I'm not deaf to the power of microaggression. I see that as an aspect of hegemony, the devil's in the details. And I'm sympathetic to the way in which comments can instantiate entire systems of exclusion. But I do feel that this kind of whinging character on the part of undergraduates, most of whom are very privileged, by the way, that they don't want to be frightened by ideas that force them to think outside of their own boxes, is the height of a kind of bourgeois spoilage. And I've had no patience for that, and I'm happy to see that critique made here today. I mean, we are in a university, for Christ's sake. And you have to challenge yourself, and you have to frighten yourself. You can't live in a bubble. Where I have a little bit of hesitation with Andy's presentation is with this notion of science. Now, I agree that epistemology is really important in politics, and when you get a a discourse, as Andy pointed out, of false facts and of alternative narratives and alternative facts. And when you have an administration that is destroying scientific data on climate change in the open, because it's an inconvenient truth, so to speak, then obviously I can't understand how our Congress, our senators and representatives can allow that to happen. We have an administration now that I'm beginning to feel sympathies for the CIA. It's like, poor guys, they do their work, some of them get some facts down, and Trump won't listen to it. So this is really, it's a dangerous period in a nonpartisan way, even for Republicans. So just prediction, Trump is not going to last 6 months. He's going to resign as the investigation increases because he doesn't have the psychological resources to handle the pressure. And 2, the Republicans are going to split because, like rats on a sinking ship, they're going to have to decide at what point staying with him is going to cost them their reelection. So that's my short-term prediction, but that's a surface interpretation. The opposition that Andy gave between science on the one hand and idealism and relativism, that's something I want to talk about. But I want to start with a distinction between what I'll call real science or actual science, the sort of stuff that particle physicists do and biologists do. And you know, when you read about this stuff, I'm not an expert on this, but when you read about it, it's not always so cut and dry. Even I've done some of the popular reading on what's the physics model now? It's
String theory?
no, I'm talking about when you
String theory.
Quantum theory?
quantum. Thank you. Where there's a lot of indeterminacy. You can't measure location, velocity of electrons at the same time, and that the position of the observer has some kind of impact on the measurement of reality. And that has interesting philosophical dimensions. I'm not going to dwell on that. I do think that there is such thing as a scientific method, and that works in the physical sciences. So let's just keep it at that. And it's pretty good. And if you start messing with it, and if you start shutting down funding for experimentation and data that get generated, and the opportunity to try and repeat the same results, science is in peril. But I also think there's such thing as scientism, which is the ideology of science. It's the ideology of, for example, physical anthropology in the 19th century, where in the name of science, physical anthropologists would prove that people of lower so-called races had smaller brain cases and were less capable of cognitive thought and of civilization, etc. And I think physical anthropology's had a checkered career that way. In the name of science, all sorts of political and historical inequalities have become naturalized. So you have to be careful about that. So we like science, we don't like scientism. What worries me when scientific socialists start talking about science, when Marxists start talking about science in this kind of reductive way that even Marx himself objected to as vulgar Marxism, as vulgar materialism, then the game gets a little scary. And the reason I say this is that not only were members of my immigrant family from Russia who were quite leftist, very disillusioned by the show trials and the killing of the old Bolsheviks by Stalin in the 40s. But we saw how in Africa also, from the 1970s on, a new wave of revolutionary action that broke from the popular socialist traditions of Nyerere and Senghor, which sort of looked at the past in order to rebuild the future, toward a kind of monopoly on the truth, a state socialism that claimed scientificity in order to bolster the power of a one-party state. You have to have mechanisms that can block that in any revolutionary socialist society, and it worries me when I hear the language of scientific analysis as a Marxist or leftist analysis. It smacks of a kind of monopoly on the truth, and and especially when a vanguard party has the opportunity and the mandate to speak on behalf of the proletariat or on behalf of those whom it's going to liberate. We know what can happen. As Juan pointed out, very few revolutions can we look at now and sort of be happy with, although I'm a little partial to Cuba myself, certainly in the context of Batista's regime. And epistemologically, I think there are serious differences between social science and hard science. And you mentioned one of them. I think we agree that this is an important difference. We differ on how significant that difference is. I think that, I'm not the one to originate this, but the social sciences involve people who are themselves are interpretive agents. And it involves subjectivity and an interpretation. People don't always make rational decisions. We're not like electrons and chemical bonds. And I think applying a scientific method on the model of the hard sciences to the social sciences gets you in trouble. I think it's different. And what I call the science that's appropriate for social science is critical theory. And critical theory is based in Marx's theory. Historical materialism is a critical theory. The Frankfurt School developed it a little further. And critical theory is really important, first of all, because, as you pointed out, Andy, it allows you to see the underlying structures to surface phenomena. So part of Marx's genius is that he looked at classical political economy. He looked at Adam Smith and David Ricardo and even James Mill, and he showed that these theories were based on abstract universal concepts of money, of value, of price, of labor that were actually historically specific. And that you can't take those concepts and apply them transhistorically. And he showed that his genius was not just to show that their ideas were wrong, he was able to show why those ideas developed when and where they did, as part of legitimating ideology, as part of a way of naturalizing a market. That's powerful stuff, and that's what's the beauty of critical theory. That's not what hard science does. Hard science doesn't take into account the mistakes of its predecessors. It simply refutes them on the basis of evidence. So this is why I don't think the issue is whether Avakian has a new synthesis that is really scientific. If you tell me that, and you tell me to buy into it, and what's going to happen if I don't buy into it? Am I going to be shut down? Is there a space for critical opposition to that? And as a privileged member of a university, believe me, we don't want to live in societies where we're not allowed to speak oppositional thoughts and ideas. We don't want to be in a society that forces us to pass a certain political test before we can go to another country and give a paper at a conference. That's the problem with Cuba, is my colleagues there have to get vetted by the state in order to be approved to come here to give a talk. Not cool. So in that sense, I pull back a little bit when it comes to the science, non-science alternative. As far as idealism and relativism are concerned, I think that critical theory can provide the grounding for explaining why relativism emerges when it does. It's a species of liberal pluralism, really. It's a species of the market. It's part of bourgeois economy. And idealism, I think, is a very fascinating dimension in social theory and in Marx's thought. The way I learned Marx, and it's not the only way, was to really read him in relation to Hegel and the phenomenology of mind. And what's fascinating about Marx is that he has a very healthy respect for idealism. And in fact, the very distinction between materialism and idealism is itself, in some sense, artificial. Because we draw the line as human beings in a cognitive capacity. I do think that the project of historical materialism, which is to understand action and understand human interaction and production through human sensuous practical activity, to understand consciousness through sensual practical activity is crucial. But I do fall back a little bit and worry when I hear that the scientific approach to revolution and to understanding society, which of course by implication is going to yield one result. That's where I push back, and that's where I think I would encourage some dialectical conversation, and I'll end it at that.
Thank you. So grab a seat. I'm going to just say just a brief couple things about the Bob Avakian Institute, and invite Juan and Andrew and Andy up to I think speak to each other, and then also we have not tons of time, but some time for discussion and questions from y'all. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. I just briefly, I would actually, including, before people go, speaking to actually even some of what's just been raised by Andy and then Juan and Andrew, I really recommend people leave here with some of Avakian's work. There's a Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, which speaks directly to some of what Andrew just raised, as well as the New Communism and an interview with Ardea Skybreak on science and revolution. Just briefly, the Bob Avakian Institute is an educational institution that's aiming to project, preserve, and promote Avakian's vision and works throughout all of society, to break open exactly this kind of discussion, which is not happening anywhere, frankly, on the level and the scale it needs to. I won't say more about the breakthroughs in Avakian's work. I think we're going to hear more about that in a minute. But there is something very profound to get into here that I really, again, encourage people to leave here with some of that work. You know, and I do think if you look at the state of the world, and if you look at not just the immense suffering that the planet is buckling and the masses of people on the planet are buckling under, but also the, frankly, the inability to dream, to think beyond what it is we're living with today. And I had a discussion with a law professor who said the politics and the movements today are stuck in transactional terms. And I think that's true, and it captures some of the confining, not just of our physical beings, but frankly of what we think is possible for humanity. And this is some of the import of getting Avakian's work throughout society. So I want to encourage everybody here to work with the Bob Avakian Institute. This program here, this discussion that we're breaking open, we want to do many more of these in the fall here on this campus and campuses throughout the country. If you're a professor, get into Avakian's work, integrate it into your courses. If you're a student, go to Avakian's work to think about and how do we understand the problems in the world and how they could be radically different. The conversation today is on the question of epistemology, but Avakian's body of work and on the basis of that scientific approach, there's a body of work that Avakian speaks to, everything from culture to law, to questions of democracy, the nature and the material basis for fascism, white supremacy, male supremacy, and again, building on and looking at that experience of the first stage of communist revolution and looking at building on that and how we can go further and do better next time power is in the hands of the people. But there's a tremendous body of work to get into here that I encourage people to very much integrate into your coursework, into your papers, into your dissertations, and come talk with me afterwards about the work of the Institute. And I'll just, one other way that people can be part of this is there's a program of being a friend of the Bob Avakian Institute. And this is, I really encourage, in particular, faculty, but also grad students and students to be part of this, to be a friend, to be part of the organization of the Institute, both by giving a financial contribution annually, and then also work with us. How can this work be made known throughout society? Whether you agree with all of it or disagree with much of it, it actually can make a big difference if this is engaged in every corner of society. And so I encourage everybody to become a friend of the Bob Avakian Institute. And I'll end with this from Avakian, which is a quote from him from the New Communism. He makes this point. He says, there is an urgent need for this new synthesis of communism to be taken up broadly in the society and in the world as a whole. Everywhere people are questioning why things are the way they are and whether a different world is possible. Everywhere people are talking about revolution, but have no real understanding of what revolution means, no scientific approach to analyzing and dealing with what they're up against and what needs to be done. Everywhere people are rising up in rebellion, but are hemmed in, let down and left to the mercy of murderous oppressors, or misled onto paths which only reinforce, often with barbaric brutality, the enslaving chains of tradition. Everywhere people need a way out of their desperate conditions, but do not see the source of their suffering and the path forward out of the darkness. And that historic work is the work that the Bob Avakian Institute is doing, and that I want to invite everybody here to be part of. So with that, I want to invite you guys to come up, and we're going to take 1 second to move these mics.
can use it. What would your father say? What would your father say?
We got room for you there? or-
Yeah. Political science, David Apter is your father.
Okay, so how you doing? Got one hand already, and I've got, when you were speaking, Juan, people were handing me notes of their questions, and so I missed a little bit. I guess since you responded to me, I'm supposed to go first in this discussion. So I know there's hands, but is this working, or can you hear me? Can you hear it out in the hall?
Yeah.
Okay, good. A lot has been raised, and so there's a lot to delve into. And the point that I think the three of us share, and was spoken by both of you, was that the world is really at a perilous moment. And the engagement with how to get free from that really matters. And on that, we have to engage when you have a theory that's come to, and a leadership that's come forward that says, here's a way out, it merits getting into. Almost every question that was raised by both of the discussants is spoken to in different works, and I don't know if it was, I think maybe after the program I can point to some of that. I did want to just mention that there's a theoretical journal that we publish called Demarcations, and there's a polemic in that on a revolutionary who opposes Bob Avakian from India called Ajit. And in this polemic that is available online, you can, many of the things spoken to by both speakers are referenced, and I would just commend that to your attention, as well as mainly the book that we've been dealing with, The New Communism. First, I guess what I want to say is number one, this is a new synthesis. That was one of the notes that was passed to me. I think, was that by you or somebody over there? It is a new synthesis. It's not just saying we're adding on. It's actually taking a look at what's been brought forward before, upholding what in it, which is the essence of Marxism, of communism as a science, upholding the essence of that, but also it's breaking with those aspects of Marxism that were not scientific. And there were a few. For example, one thing that Juan spoke to was the negation of the negation. This is something that Bob Avakian, is a philosophical term. He critiqued this a long time ago, because the idea that was taken as the essence of Marx, or a key point philosophically in Marxism, that you go through one epoch and go to another aspect, and that communism was inevitable, is just not true. It doesn't correspond to reality. It's possible for human history, as we've all discussed, to actually fucking end. Can I say that? Not being broadcast, right?
You're at a university.
Okay, they just end if these people destroy the planet, but also history can move backwards as well as it can move forward. Nothing is inevitable about this. It's just the working out of the contradictions of the system itself. But one of the things that's important in this is, that speaks to maybe something you both said, is that Avakian's new synthesis is not a closed system. Now, I would say that communism was never totally a closed system, although it had those. If you have a theory of inevitabilism, and then you actually it ends up closing it off. So this is a really important breakthrough. In other words, that it is something that's taking in everything else, and like any science, it develops. The essence of Marx is correct. Marx discovered what? He said before he came along, classes, people knew there were classes and they could talk about classes. But what he showed is that the classes were transitory. that there were different modes of production, that humanity had organized, and that every society is about the production and the reproduction of the means of life. And it happens through it's happened through different kinds of economic systems, different modes of productions, whether it was slavery, feudalism, and now capitalism, imperialism. And it's not inevitable that we'll get to communism. But he said that you could actually see that things don't have to stay the way they are. So that's one thing he discovered. And he said once you uncover the interconnection of things, which is what we've been getting at, once you discover the interconnection of things, you can then begin to go to work on it. He says that they actually can collapse in theory before they can collapse in practice. And so, so this is an important insight. The other thing I just want to point to is that Marx, I'm speaking to Juan on Marxism, that he did discover, which Andy brought into, Andy or Andrew? Okay, both. I know we're both thankful when that's all we get called. But that at the essence of capitalism is the fundamental contradiction between the socialized production of social production, which is how everything is produced under capitalism, and the private appropriation, which does involve fundamentally the motive force of that is the accumulation of profit that comes from surplus value. But what actually moves all of that, and this is a big thing that Avakian has brought forward, is the competition between capitalists. We are getting into political economy, but the fact is that this is a competitive system that's always the driving force of it is not that they can't be regulated. It has to actually be, it's constantly competing for advantage. And capital also aggregates in nations. These are things that are true. They're not Eurocentric. They're a discovery of the nature of the mode of production. And that's the key thing. Now, was Marx somewhat limited by the historical experience of his time? Did Marx make mistakes? Yeah, any scientist is, and yes, we are all human and we're going to make mistakes. The question of science is to actually move forward from the mistakes, and you understand new things about reality. Was Newton superseded by Einstein? Yes. Do we want to ignore those parts of Newton that are still relevant? I don't think so. We'd have a lot of problems if we said none of that applied. Does everything have to be observed? Well, apparently they are going to send a satellite to get close to the sun, but nobody's actually gone around the other side of the sun to be sure there's one and actually seen this whole thing. You know, this is, I mean, come on. There's theory that you can test in practice through theoretical work that then corroborates that theory. So we can understand the thing, and not every
hypothesis is not a theory.
No, there's a hypothesis which then has to be backed up by evidence, not all of which is observable in the form of directly through the eyes of the observer. Now, there's new philosophical developments that have come off of some of the latest developments in physics, which I will just commend you. There's too many questions. I don't want to take the time to get into. There's an article that Avakian's written called The Crisis in Physics that deals with how that has given rise to a new round of relativism, which we can discuss. But I did want to just touch briefly on something that Andy said, which is the new synthesis is, there is lots of room. And it's mandated that there's room for dissent. I was looking for that constitution that was authored by Bob Avakian. But look, it says that some of the fundamental rights that people have is actually under the new Socialist Republic in North America is the right to first of all, the most fundamental right is to remake society, to act in the interest of overcoming all forms of oppression. But to make that possible, you have to have the kind of atmosphere that you were talking about, where there's actually dissent, where there's creativity, where there's ferment. Where here's a difference from the question that somebody passed me. What's different from the old communism? Well, for one thing, there's no official ideology in this new socialism, because when you have official ideology, you run into the problem that you're describing in the first socialist states, which is that in order to get along, you got to go along. That's not the case. That's not going to be the case. That's a very big difference. And including this understanding that the masses of oppressed people do not have a special purchase on the truth, even as the revolution is in the interest of that class whose only interest, and this is where Marx was right, is in overcoming classes and all forms of oppression. So there's other things I can bring out that are radically different as a matter of law, but let me say two things. One, as a matter of process, at the heart of Avakian's new synthesis is a conception of what we need and how things need to develop is with a solid core with a lot of elasticity. And that means in a new society, and even in the movement for revolution today to the maximum extent possible, you need to have a solid core of understanding of where the world needs to go that can be scientifically determined. It doesn't need to go to just a point of where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It has to get beyond a society where there is a first and a last. Okay? That you have to have a solid core society that understands that you're not resting now with just the new state. This is a big leap. Because what happens if you have a socialist revolution? I'm not talking about Bernie's socialism where you elect some other ruling class people to rule. I'm talking about a socialist revolution, an actual revolution, that you that you're trying to work your way through this. So you have, my point was that now the working class, the oppressed people, are now the ruling class. Well, that changes their perspective on things. Like maybe the revolution has gone just far enough. Thank you very much. You actually have to continue that. So you need a solid core, but on that basis, the maximum elasticity, the maximum amount of creativity, flexibility that you can have without actually rupturing where you're trying to go and losing the whole thing. That's a contradiction. Avakian calls it, you have to be willing to go to the brink of being drawn and quartered. So this is something that's radically different, and it's concretized in this new constitution. So maybe, there's so many things. My God, you guys raised a lot of questions. Oh, scientism. And is Marxism Eurocentric? I'm just putting those two concepts together because I think in how you spoke of the Eurocentrism and how you spoke of scientism, that could be this.
The history of my culture, there was a group of people who were devotees to the extreme of knowledge through empirical facts, right? And their popular name got to be one of derision, right? Científicos, because the last thing they were was in science and in the service of the people. They were exploiters of the people.
Well, yeah, there's bad science, and there's science that was historically conditioned. These are things that are true. You can look at the pseudoscience and science that was used, and see, everything's contradiction. So will the ruling class try to use science and promote science which is unscientific? We are experiencing that right now. In other words, Trump will bring out his scientists, although you can't find very many of them to back up what he's saying. But they will. There are some, and should they succeed, they will have sway in society. This is something we saw in Germany.
The thing about Trump is he doesn't care about science. I mean, he's actually so off the charts. We've never seen anything like this.
Well, he is, but you can't
Obviously,
be distracted by the madness.
Absolutely, no. There's a method to the madness.
And here's the problem. Pence is not meant, well, as I said before, and some people might have read this, that anybody who refuses to eat with a woman without their wife present has a certain level of madness, but it's actually a theocratic madness. This is Pence, but see, but Pence is a rational person who has an irrational theology and actual fascist program for America.
Sure,
This
anyway,
is, but they will bring up science for this. So let me stop right here and just say that the question is not. It has got to be something that's thoroughly scientific, which is why we're saying this is a new synthesis, to discard those elements of Marxism and of the previous experience of communism that were not scientific. And then, I'm going to leave aside for right now how we sum up the first socialist states, why they were defeated, what were their strengths, what were their shortcomings. They're important to get into, but I'm looking at the clock and realizing maybe that'll come out from questions from the audience or from both of you. So those are just some first remarks. Yeah, it's up to you guys. Do you want to respond? Should we call on his?
I think we should call.
Yeah,
let's let the.
So his gentleman back there in the teal shirt.
I'm David, and I want to just thank One Center, Professor Darnell, for having this and with courage to tackle this. And Andy, for you, I got to tell you, you're probably the James Brown of politics, because you're the hardest working man in politics from what I see. Because, first of all, it seemed after the collapse of communism, the conversation was just lost. And so with Trotskyism, there was the idea of maybe international workers' revolution. And if you're talking about a synthesis of a new communist perspective now, I don't really see it in what you've presented so far. At least I'm not trying to be harsh here. I got a lot to grow myself, and I just want you to tell me where I'm wrong. But at least Lenin, he had a way of developing Marxism where it failed in terms of what it needed for the Russian peasantry that wasn't affected by the mass industrialization at the time. We'll take it to another stage. But Stodelin is what he said. What is to be done? That's what I want to hear from anybody talking about communism now, because if I was going to be a communist when I was 20 years old and I was angry and black, that was the time when I would have joined. I didn't join then. And I'm still black, but I'm not so angry anymore. And I'm not hearing anything, but I'm still receptive. I'm still receptive. And Professor Quiñones, you're a brilliant man, but you're pessimistic in your view. And I understand. You know, so we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see if something gets done. And my professor Apter, critical theory is about all we're left with now. That's the only thing that keeps me going is critical theory, so we can micro-analyze these little things that bother us and tailor-fitting for what our identity perspective is on it. But you sort of leave it an open question as to me. Okay, with your friend in Cuba who was not going, that has to have permission to put his paper out, right? We understand that process, right? But I mean, come on. So we don't talk about how in the university today, in the institutionalized racism, structuralized all the biases that we can pick at now, that somehow those filters don't prevent people from getting their message out. Also, just more subtle, more of a subversive way of quelling people's voices and allowing them to develop agency. Also, I see it here, and I'm thinking sometimes I should just stay working in the motion picture industry instead of going back to school. I'm sorry. I'm just.
Well, first of all, you're too good a student to go back to the motion industry. This guy's amazing. I have to say, he's a seriously critical thinker in my class on African post-colony. No, I agree with you too. I mean, the topic today really is epistemology, and it has to do with, the relationship between knowledge and ideology and reality. This isn't to say that, and I think that the same kinds of techniques for uncovering the hidden filters that you're talking about is exactly what we have to do and are doing. So I'm not in any disagreement with that. What I was anticipating is a society which claims science as if it becomes a monopoly on a certain purchase on political reality, then that system becomes vulnerable to the kinds of constraints I was talking about. You may feel that it's better that way than the kind of silent hegemonic exclusions that occur here. That's another discussion.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Did you want to respond to that or no? Okay, look, but the question is what is the source of the problem? What are the different layers and complexity of that problem, and how do we bring about change? And the question of science that I'm speaking about is as a method and approach. It's a method and approach to understanding reality in its changingness, in the dialectics of its changingness, as well as in its historical development. But I want to back up a second, because you began by saying that you're worried about the RCP being a cult of the personality. If you come a cult around Bob Avakian, if you have heard anything I've said today, it's that there's a method and approach for understanding the world as it actually is, and that what Bob Avakian is fighting for is to enable people to, including people who have had no education, as well as people who are graduate students and postgraduate students and professors, to understand the world as it actually is. That's the point. That's not a cult of personality. At the same time, we do recognize that something has been brought forward which makes a very big difference, and we're fighting to get it out there in the world, just the way people did fight to get Lenin out there at the time that he came forward, or you were the one who mentioned Lenin. Then this is important. There's a cult around Bernie, there's a cult around, oh my God, the cult around Obama, for God's sake. The problem is they didn't actually put forward a method for understanding reality. Maybe you like one person's program better than the other, but that's not what's at the heart of the new synthesis. And one thing I would commend to you is to do some work, to look into the work and see that it's the farthest thing from that. And very often, in fact, I would say, and believe me, you can't be the spokesperson for Revolution Books and not having people come tell you every day that you're in a cult, okay? and then I say to people, so what have you read of Bob Avakian? Well, except for Andy, very few people have read all that much. But they still have this very strong opinion about this, because they've been told this by whom and for what reason. To keep you away from looking at revolution, to keep you where you've been for too long, to keep you in a situation where revolution has been taken off the agenda and all you can do is deal with microaggression, which actually I agree with him. Microaggression can be extremely hurtful, and it comes from a deep place.
Oh, yeah.
The question is, how do we understand that?
People of color understand that very well.
I know.
They suffer it
every day
on an hourly basis.
On an hourly basis, and some of what we can learn from critical theory and from postmodernism is that a lot of this has been actually excavated through that work, including analysis of literature and art. Some of this is very important. We have learned from that. But here's something that is from Marx and that is going forward, which I'll just take a second for this, which Marx did not just talk about class exploitation and the anarchy of production that is the driving force of capital. Okay? He also spoke about something called the four alls, which many traditional Marxists, especially Trotskyists, which it sounds like some people have run into, reduce it down to just the economic sphere. Marx said that the goal of communism is to get beyond class distinctions and all the relations of production, how people come together to work. I don't know how many people it took to make this shirt. Well, maybe this one not so many, but many of our clothes take thousands and thousands of people all around the world were involved in the production, the relations of production. And all the social relations that correspond to it are now confined by those relations. For example, the oppression of women predates capitalism by a long shot, but it's now confined and constricted within those economic relations. It doesn't mean that the class struggle is here and the oppression of women is there. It means that you actually have to get the dialectical interplay of those things, but the communist revolution is overcoming all those production relations, all those social relations, and all the ideas that reinforce those social relations, which is where we can learn something from critical theory. But the thing where critical theory gets wrong and misses is what's the driving force of this, and why, in fact, you need an actual revolution to set into motion a different mode of production that's not based on private profit, that's not based on the accumulation of capital at the expense of labor, but it's based on need, and then going to work on that basis to overcome all these other divisions. Nobody else is putting forward this radical vision. I'm sorry. Tell me one person who's doing this, including some of these revolutions that have gone place, including Cuba. This is part of what you don't like about Cuba, is Castro is narrow among, in many different ways, and he also subordinated that revolution to the Soviet Union at a time that the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, it was capitalist. These are big questions, but I think what I want to, if you leave with nothing else, is there's a scientific approach to understand this. It doesn't mean scientism. It doesn't mean that if you look at this Constitution, that those who say if it's determined something, this is what we think the direction of society, it doesn't mean that we don't want dissenting voices. You got to have those dissenting voices, including from the people who oppose you. See, this is another thing. Whoever asks what's new here is Avakian has integrated the John Stuart Mill point of that those opinions should be brought forward by the most ardent advocates of it, and not as was done in some previous societies by people who were stigmatized based on their class origin or the fact that they were deemed counter-revolutionary. You need those ideas aired in society. This is radically different than any social society before. So let me...
Can we get?
Yeah.
I don't think the issue is whether there's a cult or not. The issue is the program, the writing, the analysis, and to what extent is its promises to be fortuitous for the present and the future, and what are the lacunae in those writings, just as there are lacunae in those of Marx. If we get stuck in talking about whether it's a cult or not, I don't see us moving the discussion forward. I guess some people will say yes and others will say no, and there you are. I think what's important in what he does, and surely there must be others outside the immediate circle of the RCP, is analysis that brings us out of the situation of today, or promises to do so, because there is an urgent need. If with whatever shortcomings Marx had, it did serve as a springboard, intellectual, analytical springboard, going forward. And you can say the same in regards to Lenin and others. So is the need being met here? Is the need being met elsewhere? How could it be constructed beyond what there is? And it does come to a critical discussion of this work, which is challenging, but it's an invaluable contribution, given that there is so little else. And I don't want to make the metaphor of, it's beautiful because it's the only rose in the field. So if that is the case, one might ask why, in a society of 320 million, all they can do is sort of reprint, stuff that international publishers were doing, 80 years ago, and stuff like that. So I'm for the dialogue, but I'm also for criticism as well as appreciation. It's like Cornel West said, he's a long distance runner that thinks with every step, and I do want to get into the criticism of him, and certainly take up some of the aspects of the society that I don't think are being dealt with. But that's for another occasion. Somebody else. I think we're talking too much, and the people are not talking enough.
I agree with what you just said, and that's why we're doing this, and we need a lot more engagement on the basis of what it is, and then we can, and that is, again, the farthest thing from what a cult is. It's that, in other words, what we want is to have the engagement to be able, and for the reasons you said, to verify, is it true? Are there lacunae? In anything, there's lacunae, actually. But then the question is, are they fundamental, or are they, and what are they, and can we do better? There are two hands, or three hands. But the gentleman in the back said, hand up front.
You guys are too smart. You have to dumb it really down. Seriously. You have to bring it down to the way people understand. Here's a comment. Here's something like, what got me here is here's a scientific method. Give me some solutions. One is, there's a guy named Richard Wolff who talks about cooperatives. How do you merge capitalism, communism, and socialism into one? So give me some solutions. That's what's going to get people here. Something that's scientific, that got me here. What are some solutions to that? Those three things, if you do that, people will be gobbling this up.
What are the three things again?
Well, one, I said was, there's a guy by the name of Richard Wolff. We should all be, we should be listening to what he says. And so if I come here and you tell me, well, go do the research, no, I'm here to learn it from you. Don't go tell me to get it from someplace else. And when I say you're being too smart, I mean, you guys are very, come on, this is good. But bring it down to, so that if you want the peasants, the people who are supposedly downtrodden, to understand this, you've got to talk to people in a way that they understand what you're talking about.
Okay. There's here and there's somebody over there. Okay, yeah. Okay, let's get all four.
Okay, I was under the impression we were doing one question at a time. Okay, so anyways, we've been talking a lot about science, so I want to get back to that. I've read the 6 points of attention of RevCom, and I agree with them, but I haven't yet read concrete evidence that would support communism, and I want to pose some questions. It's kind of multifaceted. What exactly is it about communism, specifically new communism, that makes it scientific? And also, why do you think communism is the most liberatory system possible? And why do you think it is superior to capitalism and better in meeting real needs? More in tune with the natural environment and its ecosystems, and better at advancing progress for humankind. What concrete numbers or evidence can you provide to answer this and back your claims? And also, what relevant information can be gathered from the experience of Russia and China and other nations with revolution to answer these questions?
Anything else?
Say one question.
Here and then back there. Yeah.
As far goes, as I've been researching quantum physics myself, I do believe that observational reality is the most important thing, and the scientific method is also one of those things. That's why I came here, and I wanted you to look at that paper. That's it.
Oh, but he,
Which paper is
but
it?
he handed this, he handed this.
And that's my question. Do you think observational reality makes a difference then?
And then Professor Macias. Here, I'll see if I can find it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask a concrete question that was tied to the Constitution, particularly since you mentioned some of the differences in the new, with the emphasis on new synthesis, that there'd be a different social relationship and dialogue, if you will, post-revolution. But it begs the issue on the nature of the state post-revolution, whether there will be a state, and particularly within a multinational population. The Constitution gives the right for, if you will, secession, dealing with the national minority question, which is a very, let's say, traditional Marxist thought in relationship to method and revolution. So is that part of the new? Is that part of the synthesis? Or what aspect of it, or is it not Marxist, especially in relation to some of the comments that Professor Gómez-Quiñones made with regards to Chicano.
And just to show the data revolution result, just read that for them.
We're short on time, so if they can speak to the question you raised and not with the additional stuff, is that okay?
I just think it relates. It's
Okay, here, let's.
distance away.
You're quoting the band Cage the Elephant here? Okay.
Wave. This is the wave. At the time.
Okay, I have to say I don't understand your question. So I mean,
It's
I
about
don't know.
observation.
I mean, I understand what you said, but I don't understand
I'm
what
saying,
you're putting in front
do
of
you
us.
think that something from this distance to 7 hours away can affect what you just looked at when President Trump just held a signing and had nothing to sign? Yeah. I'm saying they're correlatory. Either way.
You must want to talk to that. I think we have.
Or there were other questions before as well.
Well, there's a question from the back, and you mentioned Richard Wolff, is that it?
Yeah.
I'll definitely check that out. And I'm
Lake TV.
I'm sorry, I'm distracted in my memory banks, and I can't remember the last name of Paul something, but he wrote a book called Green Commerce. Does anyone know this? And other books. And I find his work really sympathetic to my own sort of practical side of how to break the current impasse we have and the growing inequality. I mean, I just read today that the CEO of Yahoo was making $999,000 a week, and the company still was losing. So this is obviously has to stop. So I think there are two things that, and it has to do with the cooperative organization. You have to redefine the legal structure of the corporation, for one thing.
Well, they're already doing this in England.
Just let them speak to what you're raising, because we're short on time. So.
Right, so you wanted some practical stuff. So we have to redefine the legal status of the corporations so that corporations become financially responsible for the pollution they add to the environment, not the taxpayer. So they can't just commit that kind of pollution and get away with it. And secondly, we have to work toward a zero waste model of production, where what we produce gets, the waste gets repurposed. Those are just two aspects of a solution. And I think we need to develop a more complex, localized lattice work of production and distribution, so we're not producing stuff and sending it halfway around the world. We're dealing with smaller economies of scale that spread the surplus more equitably. That's just the short answer.
Paul Greengrass, the
Can I
last
comment on
million.
that, or?
Go ahead.
Paul Greengrass, the last million.
That's not the one, but
Well, I think this, what you brought up is a little distance away from Silicon Valley and their relations of production. But whenever I hear reports on that cooperativism dash communalism in terms of factories, what is heartened the way you are happy to see very local, successful people, community organizing in regards to a very specific project. You see a flash of what is possible. On the other hand, it's not a solution because the entire system remains intact. And basically what they have done is come up with another way of managing, which in some instances is going to be better and in others not, and that factory too will. On the other hand, it is a movement that, at least according to its advocates, is spreading. And one has to ask if it's spreading from Argentina all the way to Minnesota. What is it that it announces? Is there really a step, which I would doubt, and where you can go from cooperativism to something that is radically different economically from the bottom up? Is there a stage, a transition? On the other hand, if all you have is isolated examples of cooperatism, which have been around, as you know, going back to the 18th century actually, right? I think it's good for the people participating in it. I don't know how really politically meaningful it is in regards to significant economic transformation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, some of us had some personal experience in the 60s trying the models of communes, and actually you can go back to read a work by Frederick Engels called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, where he criticizes the 19th century cooperative efforts. Look, the problem with Richard Wolff is that he's not scientific. He's a bourgeois liberal populist at best, and it's very misleading. It's very, but that because if you could do this, and where they actually are doing it, you spoke to Buenos Aires, Argentina. They're actually, and in Greece, there have been some movements of workers' cooperatives. But if you don't get to the fundamental way that society is organized and how production, who owns the means of production, what's the division of labor in relationship to that, how do different sectors of the economy trade with each other, how does one commune trade with another? Or is everybody going to go to Vietnam and go to the rubber trees to get the rubber, then come back to Buenos Aires, and you have to trade between these. What's going to regulate all of that? You very soon, in a heartbeat, find yourself right up against the need for some means of regulating that. It'll be one of two things. Either you will have a state as the first stage towards communism. You will have a state that can put into place a different economic system that isn't dependent on the private appropriation of labor and the law of value being the fundamental engine of society, even though it will still have some continued existence under the first stages of socialism. You're either going to have a state that does that, or you're going to have a state that enforces this mode of production. There's no way you get around that. It's not radical. You want a practical solution? Get involved in a movement for an actual revolution, how we actually raise people's consciousness today and fight the power as part of doing that so people can get involved in that struggle and begin to raise their heads. Right now we have to be involved in a ferocious struggle to stop the consolidation of fascism of this regime, but you have to actually make an actual revolution, and that's a big question. We have to tap into that radical guy who was 20 years old and now is in grad school to become a part who's contributing to that revolution today, because unless you make a revolution, the world will stay as it is. Now, the fact that the first revolutions were defeated is not a reason to then say that therefore revolution is impossible and let's look somewhere else. Let's look at its manifestations in the culture, which is a lot of what critical theory deals with, and sometimes with insight. But it's actually been, in some ways, it's a product of sidestepping the big question of how do you actually make a revolution and what happened in that first stage of revolutions. And it's actually, to do a full dissection of that now is beyond, I think, our time limit and maybe even capacity. But I would say this, I would gladly come back to have a discussion on that in relationship to this, and we could read some things that would get to that point, or even if I don't come back, somebody else could do that, and plenty of people can do it. So, but the point I'm trying to get at is you have to make an actual revolution. But the gentleman, no, go ahead.
He's reminding you to speak to the Constitution.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. Speak to the Constitution. This is what I have to say. This thing is. This is really incredible to get into, and it's going to take some. I'm sorry, it does take some work to get into something that's radically remaking the whole world, and how in fact this does talk about the leading role of a party, but actually the party is subordinate to the Constitution in this state, which is different than in the previous social societies. Look, I said in introducing my talk that we uphold the advances of those first socialist revolutions. They did accomplish very quantifiable things, whoever asked that question. Very quantifiable things. You want to compare Tsarist Russia to Russia in the 1920s? Night and day. You want to compare Russia in the 1920s to any other place in the world? In the 1920s? Night and day. Only country where women had the had the right to abortion, where women were involved in higher education in that kind of way they were there. In terms of the oppression of different nationalities. It was a tremendous, that's why it was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They went in and tried to elevate those different nationalities. I'm talking about what they started out to do.
Well, that's
now,
the problem. The problem is with all good intentions, what actually ends up happening because of political motivation and I think of the Weimar Constitution was one of the most progressive democratic constitutions in pre-Nazi Germany, but look at what it led to. So and I agree, you have to lay this stuff out. You can't move forward clearly without a blueprint. But as a social scientist, I have a certain healthy degree of skepticism and looking at the real factors that come into play when people actually start occupying these positions of determination, and then the old political logics come back. I'm not saying it's impossible, but and that's my point about scientism, is that to me is a red flag. It doesn't mean it's an impossible barrier to overcome, but it's a red flag when I hear science being invoked as the bedrock of a kind of socialist reality and social science reality. Then it just makes me nervous, but I'm not too stubborn about this.
Well.
All right, but I don't want to sidetrack that.
No, you're not.
I know there's other
No,
issues.
you're not sidetracking. This is important for everybody. It's a scientific method and approach. So just what you were describing as a social scientist, when you approach the question of Weimar Germany becoming Nazi Germany, or you approach the question of the Soviet Union and what happened in the 30s, and I think you invoked the
show trials, but also the minorities and the ethnic minorities that turned out to be a disaster.
Okay, so what you have to do, I think, in any analyzing any social process, is first look at what was the situation they were in, then what were they trying to do, what problems did they run into in trying to do what they were trying to do, including opposition from other forces within and from without their society. By what method did they try to deal with those problems? And what policies did they take? See, when you start analyzing all of that, then you can discover where there were deficiencies. In other words, it's not a light thing when we say, for example, that some of the errors, these were grievous mistakes made in the first revolution. But the fact that they were mistakes is you have to go to understand. Look, there was a wonderful progressive and revolutionary author named Lu Xun. He was an essayist and a poet in China. And he wrote this story once about that, where he was dealing with the demoralization of people in China. This is in the 1930s, I think he wrote this particular story, and people were very not so sure they could actually succeed, and a lot of bad things were happening. Okay, Japan, okay, I'm not going to get into the whole history, but he said, you go to any mother who's got a toddler who tries to walk and falls down. Would she then say, I told you never to walk? Stay on your knees the rest of your life. No, she's going to say, that was wonderful, yay! Stand up, and she'd help him walk. See, so the first socialists, you have to look at, this is the first time the slaves of the world stood up to try to make a revolution and overcome all forms of exploitation and oppression, and mistakes were made and things were accomplished, and now it's our job, and something that Avakian is undertaking.
But the birth of the revolution was there in Haiti in 1804.
And that's another revolution to learn from, and to see, well, how did it get defeated? Why couldn't it? Why didn't it succeed? How could it have succeeded? What were they up against? These are very serious. I mean, I don't think we disagree on this one. It's very moving in the beginning of this book. And I'll tell you, Revolution Books is in Harlem. Okay, we have a lot of people. We have a lot of people. I sponsored a lot of African diasporan writers, writers from Africa. The store was opened by Bubi Watiango, not that he opened the store, but he was there at the opening thing. And one of the things that it's always struck me is I was inspired by some of the African liberation struggles, and then when you think about what actually has become of that struggle today, it's heartbreaking. And the book begins with the story of Angola, where Avakian draws from the looting machine, where this was led by different groups of revolutionaries, one of which was the MPLA, and today, it's a horror show there. And one of the things they point to is the daughter, Santos, of the leader of the MPLA, was the first woman billionaire in Africa. This is a horror show. Why? It wasn't for lack of heroism, Avakian points out. It wasn't for lack of bleeding. These people were inspiring. I was telling somebody last night, I had a poster on my wall from Guinea-Bissau before I even knew where Guinea-Bissau was, because I was so inspired by it. But then you have to go deeper. What were they trying to do? By what method were they trying to fight? Why did they do what they did, and what did they run against? Because it's not, go back to the people united will never be defeated. Sometimes people were defeated because the enemy was just fucking stronger. That's what it was. But then you actually have to go deeper. And this is what, if we get nowhere else today, it's to encourage people to get into that. In terms of the black national question and the right to secession of black people that's upheld in this Constitution, the materialist reasons why that's still upheld, it was something that did exist in previous analysis of communists, is not to just uphold the old communism, but it was based on painstaking work that was done of going through the census statistics, going through lots of things, and coming to a determination that actually the unity you need for revolution has to be based on real unity. And black people have been systematically oppressed and denied fundamental rights in this country, and actually were forged in many ways as a nation. And that right to secession, even though this Constitution doesn't make it so easy to secede, but it does actually uphold the right. It's a fundamental right of forging the unity of peoples, particularly of people who've been at the heart of the oppression and the accumulation of wealth in this country, along with the indigenous people, and I'm including there the theft of land from Mexico.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the reasons you see Native American movements as somewhat different. Native Americans don't want simply rides on buses. They want freedom. And historically, somebody owes them that right. And as I think Geronimo Pratt says, people who are struggling to be free deserve freedom. And what I believe our prior rights historically have to be listened to. And before we get into any construction or deconstruction of what a new state might look in, I certainly believe that Native Americans will insist that you're not going to have treaty makings the way you had them in the 19th century, leading up to the fact that Native Americans were not considered citizens until 1924, 1929. Their calls for freedom, whether they're a small scattered group or very solid ones, whether on a different scale, a Hopi or the Navajo, and a couple of hundred other groups. I mean, this country was built on the exploitation and genocide of Native American peoples. That's how they cleared the land so that they could work it. And we all know what you mentioned in your talk. I think you did Baptiste's, eye-opening book on you don't know the
half has never been told.
That is, this country's so-called development and capitalist uniqueness came out of the blood and sweat of Africans.
And I would just add that where some of the things you pointed out about Marx, where there were shortcomings, particularly in relationship to people in India, it's also important for people to go back and read the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about the rosy dawn of capitalism being, and I can't do the poetry, so I don't want to destroy it, but
Best
he deals.
thing he wrote.
What?
The best thing he
Well,
wrote.
he talks about what was done to the
literary.
peoples. It is literary. It's beautiful. The exploitation of the native and indigenous peoples in the Americas and the extraction of the wealth on their backs, including the slaves themselves. So I agree. Look, if you come away with nothing else, this is going to sound simple, but here it is. The world is very complex. I think we agree on that. The world is also real. Hopefully we mainly agree on that. But that's, that it is filled with, and it moves through contradiction. The scientific method is one where you can understand that, where you actually need to be evidence-based. But evidence isn't just what you can see with your eyes. We have some disagreement with this. It's not just observational. It actually can be proved through theory that can be tested before you can actually see it. We can't go see the Big Bang. And one thing, we should always be, and Avakian says this, he said we should have some certitude, relatively speaking, which is to say we should have scientific certitude about the things we know to be true while continually to interrogate those things that we actually are basing ourselves on. You can't always start over. You have to start from what you know. We do know some things, and that's what you have to go forward on. And that how you deal with the complexity of the history of different peoples, the oppression of people on the basis of gender, the tremendous difference between mental and manual labor, and between people who grow the food and people who consume the food and live in the urban centers, what that's going to look like in the future. These are all things that we have to look at, and there's a framework for understanding that there's one mode of production or another mode of production, one kind of state structure that arises or a different kind of state structure, and we need to get to the place where we don't have states anymore. And that is, and that's an
recognizing
arduous
the
thing.
importance of agriculture agricultural production and the fate of agricultural workers. So many of us talk and we never pay attention to the most basic productivity that takes place is still agriculture.
And capitalism has resulted in, I'll just make this is one fact which probably many of you know, but in the last decade and a half, over 250,000 farmers in India committed suicide because of what imperialism has done to the land and to the agriculture. So I just want to thank both of you.
Thank you.
I hope this opens up, not just, I hope this opens up an engagement with Avakian's work, and I hope it opens up for all of you a process of engagement with to getting to the roots of the problem, and then really having the kind of discussion, discourse, argument where we're actually getting at the root of things, not just for its own sake, but in its own right, as part of the struggle to actually transform the world, because this is a synthesis of what has come before, and a synthesis of this communist theory with the actual need to make a revolution. In other words, that's part of the new synthesis, is there's actually a new strategic understanding of how you could actually defeat this imperialist monster. And that really matters, because if we don't, then the world will stay as it is. I don't care how many cooperatives you have, and what you call them, and what you relabel Bernie's real revolution. It's still the same old it's still the same old shit, but it might smell a little better for a little while, but not so good, let me tell you that. Thank you.